Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We enter a new month. It is December 1st, Monday. In the year 2014, it is a pleasure to be with you. I hope that your Thanksgiving weekend, holiday weekend, was a joyous one, and that you got an opportunity to spend time and break bread with people you really care about and that you really love. I think that's what makes this particular holiday quite special to me, is the fact that there doesn't seem to be all the negatives surrounding it that there are in other holidays, in terms of the pressures of the prices of gifts and who do I buy for, and who's expecting a gift that I don't want to buy for, and all of these things. This one is just basically about finding ways to connect with the people you care about most, and that we should connect with more often than we do. It is a pleasure to be with you today here at the Virtual Center. I hope your weekend was well. I hope you are gearing up for what promises to be a fast-moving month. The month of December always is. I think probably the Christmas holiday and New Year's at the end of it always makes for a fast-moving month. There are a lot of obligations, social obligations, parties, office parties, and various other things. So it's usually a month that goes by faster than people can handle well. But I hope that it promises to be a good one for you. I want to thank you for your willingness to give up a portion of your time, which is always quite valuable. I appreciate that very much. And of course, this time of the year, time even becomes more valuable to people. So for those of you who are listening out there live, I welcome you to today's program. I thank you for your continued support for the Head On Radio Network and for the Virtual Center. I hope that you will, if you are so inclined, pick up the phone and give us a call. The topic today is one that I think almost everybody out there would have something meaningful and substantive to say, but I'll go into that in a minute. But first of all, let me give you our phone number. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I've already mentioned in encouraging participation via phone, I've already made reference to at least the topic for today, and I was chatting with Bob Kincaid before we went on the air, and I was telling him that this particular topic is one that I thoroughly enjoy, because it's one that I can really get into, and it's one that I have found over the years that classes that I've taught, students that I've taught over the years, seem to be able to get their arms around this one. This is one that everybody can kind of relate to, I think. But again, it's a sensitive topic, because naturally, almost without fail, for all of us, it becomes personal to a certain degree. What I basically would like to address today at the Virtual Center, I'm assuming it'll be just today. It could obviously continue, because I think the topic is important enough. It's the so-called social question. I mentioned last time we were together, I mentioned that one of the finest pieces of scholarship I had ever read was written in the 1960s by Gordon Wood, entitled The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787. And it's what historians used to call intellectual history, a history of ideas. The book is filled with quotations and source materials. It is a wealth of information on research surrounding the philosophy and the attitudes which drove both the Declaration of Independence, the Confederation period within which America lived after independence, and capping with the last unit of the book with the Constitution of the United States at the very end. So this period of the so-called founding, if we could call it that, Gordon Wood makes the case that in many, many ways, the story of the creation of the American Republic is tied up with the idea of what he refers to as the social question. And I believe he provides enough research, enough scholarship to support this theme, to make the case that indeed it may not be the story behind the Constitution and behind the positions people took or refused to take on the issue of independence, but it was always there. It's kind of like the 800-pound gorilla that's always in the room, but nobody ever talks about it. It affects everybody. And it seems to me a question that all of us need to confront if we are to understand the founding, if we are to understand the origins of America's political fabric, the political institution and the society which makes that institution meaningful and substantive. I think it's a question that all of us would do well to confront if we have never ever confronted it. So I'd like to share with you a number of sources today, snippets, if you will, quotations, sentences here and there, which I believe make the point, or make a point, that what we are talking about here is quite significant. Prior to American independence, actually in the 1760s in Massachusetts, James Otis, who was an attorney in Boston during the late colonial period, was very, very influential in the onset of opposition to Great Britain in the 1770s. He probably is most associated in our books with the positions he took against the British writs of assistance and the violations of human rights that were associated with Britain's employment of so-called writs of assistance. And in talking in a letter one time about the growing inclination among Bostonians to think more and more seriously about independence from the British Empire than they ever dared even admit or believe that they ever would, Otis was making the case that as independence is talked about more and more, it's clear that there is a social division happening within society, whereas many people that were very, very outspoken at the beginning against what Great Britain was doing to the rights of colonists, to the rights of her colonists, were becoming much more reserved and quiet and much more close-mouthed, if you will, the more independence was talked about. Because, as James Otis said, there are people who, while they are more than willing to criticize the mother country, when talk of independence arises, they back off. And they become very afraid. And then Otis addressed the major issue of his letter, which was why so many people are afraid of independence. And he answered his own question by introducing what he referred to as the social factor. And that is that a lot of prominent people saw the connection with the mother country, saw the idea of British power as a safety check, as a check, or a lock, if you will, on social change. As long as the mother country was there, as long as the mother country could call the shots, whether in fact they did or not, the fact that they had the power to, that meant that the kind of changes that could happen within society were by definition limited, because the mother country always had the final word. And that gave many of these people a sense of confidence. When independence was talked about, it raised the question as to whether all the rules and all the behavior and habits of the past were to be removed. In other words, once you start something as dramatic as independence, as literally leaving the empire, as it were, once you let that genie out of the bottle, how do you ever get it back in there again? Once you start change, how do you control it? How do you stop it? John Jay, who, as we know, was first Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay made the statement in 1776 in New York that the movement for independence is really creating a personal problem for him, because he's finding it necessary to adopt more and more radical positions on issues. I'm really finding that I am forced to say things that I may not even believe, he's saying, because once the right people, the good people, once we lose control of this movement which we have started, then there's no longer any way of controlling the degree of change that occurs. In other words, if we want to make sure that the changes we have initiated are limited, then we better stay out in front of the movement in order to manage it. Because there are a lot of people who would love to be able to get out in front and create change in society that is way beyond what most of us would ever agree to support. And that's really the issue that I think we're about here. I mentioned James Otis. James Otis made a statement one time that I've seen it many, many times. And he was referring to independence and the social changes that occurred as a result of independence. And he made the following statement: whenever the pot boils, the scum will rise. I've used that line in a couple of classes that I've taught over the years, and it stuns students. Whenever the pot boils, the scum will rise. And to take that sentence, that expression, and then put it before students and say, as you read about the movement for independence, to what degree do you believe James Otis in that statement is saying something substantive about American independence in terms of who's for it and who's against it? That's really the social question related to independence. And there's absolutely no question when you look at this entire founding period that there's an incredible amount of optimism and idealism associated with independence. And the idea of creating 13 independent sovereign republics. The idea, the thought of actually putting republicanism on wheels, so to speak, giving Republican government as it was conceived and as it was understood by Montesquieu and other thinkers of the Enlightenment, to actually be involved in a movement designed or intended to implement the idea of republicanism in America was very exciting to people. And by definition, the period was filled with an incredible degree of enthusiasm, idealism, optimism. We've talked about this. We've talked about the idealism of 1776, the spirit of 1776, what people really thought independence was going to produce. Many people really believed that this was an effort to create the kind of society where there'd be no more rich and no poor, where everybody would be equal, where everybody would be respected, where everybody would respect each other and look out for each other. The ideal of community in American society. I apologize for the telephone in the background. And I'm trying to deal with the telephone that's going on in the background. I apologize. We're talking about the idealism of 1776. And we know, as we looked at the period of the 1780s, the so-called Confederation period here at the Virtual Center in previous weeks and months, we've seen the gradual demise of that optimism. We've looked at it mostly through the eyes, in the words of James Madison and other leading nationalists of the period, who began to believe that obviously the founders had too much faith in the idea of civic virtue, that maybe we were overly optimistic about republicanism and about the civic virtue that was absolutely essential to republicanism's success. Namely, that we really could have a society in which people were willing to put their own self-interest on the back burner in preference to the public interest. Maybe we were too naive. Maybe we really believed that people were better than they are. I think there's nobody that you see as conflicted about this idea as Thomas Jefferson. In many of the pieces of writing that we've looked at from the pen of Thomas Jefferson, we see this tremendous optimism, the optimism that we focused on so intently when we were looking at the Scottish Enlightenment and the influence that the Scottish Enlightenment seemed to have on Jefferson and on his Declaration of Independence. on the idea that all men were really created equal. The idea that we could create a society which was driven by a respect for equality among people. A society where different people in different lines of work would accept each other and respect each other and respect the worth of other people and the value of other people and the need for other people to make meaningful substantive contributions to the community at large. The idea of community, the idea that everybody, no matter what they do, no matter what they bring to the table, everybody has an important commitment, an important contribution to make to the good of the whole. And when everybody appreciates that and everybody realizes that and everybody is willing to respect that, then you have the kind of ideal. That's the civic virtue that the idealists of 1776 believed that republicanism required in order to be successful. And what made these particular people at this particular time in this particular place more idealistic than perhaps ever before was that here in America we really had the opportunity to put together a political system based on those principles. John Adams made the point that rarely, if ever in history, is man given the opportunity to design the political structure within which he will live. We in America have been given an opportunity that people throughout history have never had before. Governments, political systems are usually imposed on people from outside, from above, from somewhere. But the idea that people actually could sit down and debate and discuss and create and reject and add and supplement and put together the ideal system that would meet their own ideals as to what the perfect society would be about, this was a first in the history of the world. Of course there was idealism. Of course people became visionary and exceedingly optimistic. But as we know, it didn't take long, especially after the war ended and after the pressures of hanging in there together in order to successfully secure independence. Once that was achieved, once the Peace Treaty was signed in April of 1783, then the need for unity and camaraderie seemed to vanish. And in the minds of many people, people's worst inclinations not only tended to come out, but they tended to overwhelm or to submerge, if you will, people's better tendencies. And very quickly, a group of people, and I guess Madison and Hamilton would be the two that first came to mind, many people became very, very concerned about the direction that society was taking in the 1780s. And there's absolutely no question that this disillusionment, in large part, was among what Madison defined as the vices of the American political system. He believed in that very famous letter which he sent to Jefferson and to other close colleagues of his, what he called the vices of the American political system. Basically, it focused principally on the structure of government. But in reality, the reason the structure of government became a problem was because Madison had reluctantly come to conclude that the people being governed were the problem. And the worst inclinations of people were tending to come forth. And the idea is, George Washington made a very famous letter, said, maybe we've had too good a view, too positive a view about human nature. And so consequently, the social question became a major driving factor in the decisions that led to the drafting of the Constitution of the United States. And I have always found it particularly significant when Madison says in Federalist number 51, when Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. But the fact of the matter is, men are not angels. And the reality is that government itself is probably the clearest picture we have as to what human nature really is. The fact that we need government at all is about the clearest statement you can find as to what people are really like. And that overview, kind of, and I've taken probably the first half hour of our program today, but that overview seems to me to lay out the outlines, if you will, of something called the social question. So far, we've only looked at one particular piece of scholarship here, which is the James Otis quote, "Whenever the pot boils, the scum always rises." I wanted to take this opportunity to share a number of other pieces of scholarship, and I've got to credit Gordon Wood's Creation of the American Republic for this. Gordon Wood makes the point in his 10th chapter, which he entitles, not surprisingly, Vices of the System. He mentions that in 1787, in the July of 1787, John Quincy Adams delivered the commencement address at Harvard. And he made reference for the first time to what he called this critical period. And then he went on to explain that America seemed to be at the point of crisis. He used the phrase, "A crisis of the most delicate nature is taking place." John Jay found that the dangers that the nation was experiencing in the late 1780s were more than during the war itself. What we begin to see here is evidence of the disillusionment that seems to characterize the 1780s. If you put a premium on the social question, then the social question, more than anything else, becomes, in your thinking, what makes the 1780s a critical period, to use John Fiske's title in his 19th century book of the same name. Fisher Ames of Massachusetts, he was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from Massachusetts. Fisher Ames made the point, quote, "The people have turned against their teachers the doctrines which were inculcated in order to effect the late revolution," unquote. I want to repeat that because it requires some thought before you can begin to appreciate what Fisher Ames is saying. The people have turned against their teachers, the doctrines which were inculcated in order to effect the late revolution. Translation, this is me translating here. Fisher Ames seems to be admitting that in order to pull off independence, we had to put out a lot of ideas, a lot of doctrines, a lot of issues related to the power of the people and consent of the governed and the right of the people, and all power, government power, legitimate power is derived from the people, etc., etc., etc. But the implication is we didn't really believe that. That's what we had to do to pull off the movement for independence. But now the people are turning these very same doctrines against their teachers, against us. Translation, they believe this stuff. And we've got a crisis. I'm reading from a passage from Gordon Wood here. This is on page 398 of his book. His book, by the way, is 600 and some odd pages long. Gordon Wood says, the Republican emphasis on talent and merit in place of connections and favor now seem perverted, thus enabling, quote, and this is a quote from an article in the Maryland Journal in Baltimore, thus enabling, quote, the most unfit men to shove themselves into stations of influence, where they soon gave way to the unrestrained inclination of bad habits, unquote. The turmoil created by independence, the vacuum, the power vacuum created by all the loyalists going to Canada or going back to the mother country, enabled people who really didn't have what it takes to lead to move into positions of leadership throughout the American colonies. The result being we find ourselves being led by people who were not educated to lead, who didn't really learn, who never learned what true leadership is about. They may have position, they may have wealth, they may have influence, but they don't have that unwritten stuff that's associated with power, the kind of power that we can respect. The cosmopolitanism, the travel, the fact that they have the kind of quality of education that fits them for positions of leadership. They have traveled widely, that they have traveled among the best circles, that they have rubbed shoulders with the best peoples. In other words, that they have acquired all the social accoutrements associated with effective power. We are finding ourselves witnessing power based on wealth and position and opportunity, positions that people without the proper training or upbringing have been able to move into because of the turmoil precipitated by independence. Gordon Wood goes on, same paragraph. Republicanism was supposed to unleash men's ambitions to serve the state. Quote, an emulation to excel in virtue is laudable. It gives vigor to every political nerve, advances the meritorious, and produces the most happy effects in a community. But a desire of excelling in power, grandeur, and popularity tends to the certain ruin of a society. What we are seeing here is the elevation of people into positions of influence and power whose goals are personal, whose goals are selfish, whose goals are measurable in dollars and cents. People that have no concern or no commitment in the world to the public interest. They see power as a means of benefiting themselves, not the society at large. And that seems to be what the optimism of popular governments created in the early years of independence in 1776 to 1780. That seems to be what has happened. We created a monster. In the early 1780s, a proposal was made after the War for Independence was over in 1783. A proposal was made to create an organization of military officers who had served together during the War for Independence. It was entitled, going all the way back to the ancients, the Society of the Cincinnati, going back to the old idea of Cincinnatus. And it was to be an organization made up of former military officers, not enlisted men, officers. George Washington was very involved initially in the order of the Cincinnati. He believed in it. He knew most of the people that were members of it. It was considered to be a group that would get together regularly and drink together, play cards, socialize. The newspapers of America went crazy about this arrogance and elitism that was reflected or represented in the Society of the Cincinnati. There was so much opposition and so much turmoil about the Order of the Cincinnati that Washington was forced to bail on the group. It was going to become too embarrassing to be associated with a group like that. And what we see beginning to happen in America is the emergence of this anti-elitism, this egalitarianism, this idea or belief that the republics that we've created, that we are creating here, are designed to marshal in a new world in which artificial distinctions are going to be no more. And suddenly people became very sensitive to organizations like the Order of the Cincinnati that in the colonial period were very normal and very accepted. Certain people socialized together, belonged to different groups, belonged to different clubs, etc. I guess the best way to explain it in today's world is to make reference to the number of gated communities we have in America. How prevalent they have become. How expensive they are. It's very obvious that in the America of 2014, December of 2014, Americans are quite willing to spend a lot of money in order to make sure that they maintain their separation from people they choose not to associate with. I think we see a situation going on in Ferguson, Missouri right now, which suggests that race, which used to be the principal issue associated with separation in our society, segregation, if you will, but I'm talking about something that's not necessarily race-related as much as it is class-related in the 18th century. And I guess, and the analogy that I'm pointing to is the gated community today, because there's no question that obviously Americans are willing to spend a lot of money in order to control not necessarily who they choose to live with, but rather to have some control over who they choose not to live with. And so the fact is, when you go into a gated community, you have to stop at the guard gate, and you have to state your business. And more often than not, these guards at the entrances to gated communities are very well trained, very nice people. They try not to be hostile about it. But the fact of the matter is they're being paid to keep you out unless you prove that you belong in there. And that's what we're talking about. The extent to which that kind of attitude, that kind of thing existed at the time of the founding. Obviously, most of us know what we know about the American Revolution from what we learned in school. And it's pretty obvious that our teachers, our school teachers, never talked about this stuff. The implication that we are always led to believe was that there was no such thing as class, or class distinctions, or class bigotry, or whatever you wanted to call it, in the 18th century. Not amongst the founders. But I think what we're beginning to see here is some scholarship that suggests just the opposite. But what we're looking at the very beginning is evidence surfacing around the time of independence that Americans are very, very serious about the vision of 1776. When we say that we're going to become independent and we're going to create a society in which all men are created equal and endowed by God, by their Creator, with certain unalienable rights, that means that we're going to get rid of all of these artificial distinctions. We're going to create a society in which equality really does mean something. And consequently, people become very, very sensitive to class distinctions and things. I want to share with you a quote here. This is from Benjamin Rush, 1783. This revolution has introduced so much anarchy that it will take half a century to eradicate the licentiousness of the people. Quote, the pulling down of government, men now saw, tends to produce a settled and habitual contempt for authority in the people, unquote. Benjamin Rush. On the impact of 1776. This revolution has introduced so much anarchy that it will take half a century to eradicate the licentiousness of the people. The pulling down of government tends to produce a settled and habitual contempt for authority in the people, unquote. 1783. This is a person that I know very well from my research in Maryland at the time of independence and the time of the Constitution. Judge Alexander Conte Hansen in Maryland. He was a judge. And he said in 1784, the acts of almost every legislature have uniformly tended to disgust its citizens and to annihilate its credit. And I'm walking through these quotations here because I think that they are so meaningful, and they create a mood or a particular sense. Of course, Gordon Wood does quite a bit with James Madison. And Madison's talk about vices of the American political system. When Madison talks about the vices of the American political system, he's talking about the vices of state legislation, of state governments controlled by legislatures with the wrong kinds of people sitting in them. According to Republican theory, James Madison said, right and power, being both vested in the majority, are held to be synonymous. But is this truly the case? Asks Madison. Wherever the real power in a government lies, he told Jefferson, there is the danger of oppression. In our governments, the real power lies in the majority of the community, and the invasion of private rights is chiefly to be apprehended, not from acts of government contrary to the sense of its constituents, but from acts in which the government is the mere instrument of the major number of the constituents. That is a letter from James Madison to Thomas Jefferson. Let me share it with you again. According to Republican theory, Madison wrote, right and power, being both vested in the majority, are held to be synonymous. Right and power. Is this truly the case? Wherever the real power in a government lies, he told Jefferson, there is the danger of oppression. In our governments, the real power lies in the majority of the community, and the invasion of private rights is chiefly to be apprehended, not from acts of government contrary to the sense of its constituents, but from acts in which the government is the mere instrument of the major number of the constituents. What Madison is saying in this letter to Jefferson is that the idealism and the optimism of republicanism has been ill-placed. We had faith in people's ability to handle power and handle it well and treat it with respect and not abuse it. We were wrong. We had too much faith. In the ability of the people. Hang on with me here for a moment. Here we go. In South Carolina, the following appeared in a Charleston newspaper. The great body of the people, smote by the charms and blandishments of a life of ease and pleasure, fall easy victims to its fascinations. The great increase of public and private credit and paper money are not actually the result of a scarcity of species. They are rather the consequence of the degenerate character of the people. All men, rich and poor, Northerners and Southerners, are living in a manner much more expensive and luxurious than they have ability to support. This has created an immoderate desire of high and expensive living. Our citizens seem to be seized with a general emulation to surpass each other in every article of expense. Patrick Henry in 1780 said, quote, "I fear our body politic is dangerously sick." Virtue, this is from Gordon Wood, virtue was being debased by what one writer called the visible declension of religion, the rapid progress of licentious manners, and open profanity. Instead of bringing about the moral reformation that we could have expected from independence, the revolution seems to have aggravated America's corruption and sin. Luxury, the great source of disillusion and distress, has here taken up her dismal abode. Infectious as she is alike caressed by rich and poor. Luxury. I mean, these kinds of statements just go on and on and on. Here's another one. The American people are no longer uniquely virtuous. They are a luxurious, voluptuous, indolent, expensive people without economy or industry. Instead of finding general proofs of industry, economy, temperance, and other Republican virtues, we have become a nation that is more luxurious, more indolent, more extravagant than any other people on the face of the earth. We are not, said Charles Lee in Virginia, materials for divine manufacture. John Jay said, quote, "Too much has been expected from the virtue and good sense of the people." Americans, concluded William Livingston of New Jersey, Americans do not exhibit the virtue that is necessary to support Republican government, unquote. All men must eat together at one table and their labor be put into common stock. In short, let individuals be poor and the state rich, and then set off in your Republican career. But if you attempt it on any other plan, you may be sure it will come to nothing. People began to turn to government in order to resolve this problem. And so increasingly people began to look at institutional reform as a way to address the social problems that were becoming much too frightening and much too prevalent in American society. Benjamin Rush, again, 1787. It is absurd for Americans to cry out after the experience of 3 or 4 years that we are not proper materials for Republican government. Rush is still hanging on to the hope. He's still optimistic. And he said, it's only been 3 or 4 years. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater yet, is what he's saying. The American Revolution, Rush declared, is not yet over. We've changed our forms of government, but it remains yet to effect a revolution in our principles, opinions, and manners, so as to accommodate them to the forms of government we have adopted. Let us have patience. Our Republican forms of government will in time beget Republican opinions and manners. All will end well. I'm struck by the very famous statement issued early in the football season by Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers, when the Packers lost the first couple of games of the year. And in a radio interview, Aaron Rodgers told the people of Green Bay and Wisconsin to relax. And of course, he was right, because Green Bay is now sitting on top of the football world. Besides religion, of course, Benjamin Rush also puts his faith in education, and we know that before. We've looked at his modes of education proper in a republic. Quote, wisdom and knowledge as well as virtue diffused generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties. It is imperative that government spread the opportunities and advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people. Already, people like Benjamin Rush are looking to the schools to solve our social problems. And of course, we spend a lot of time here at the Virtual Center doing just that, looking at how people continue right up until today to see the answer to all of our social and political problems being resolved in the classroom by our teachers. The problems of violence, the problems of substance abuse, the problems of spousal abuse, addictions of various kinds. All of these things, we tend to assume we can fix them in our classrooms. And the fact of the matter is our classrooms have become more social laboratories than places where young people begin to learn and appreciate learning and knowledge and respect knowledge. One more as we approach the top. It's 57 minutes after the hour. As we approach the top of the first hour, let me just share one or two other comments with you to make this case. Only the institutions of government arranged in a certain manner could manage a people that has proven to be unvirtuous. Americans must find a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. In the state of Maryland, in the mid-1780s, the House of Delegates passed the following: that since religion hath the most powerful influence upon manners, and as such an intimate connection with government, it is the duty of this legislature to make permanent provision for religion's administration and support throughout this state. So states are beginning to look to government, looking to education, and looking to God as a way to address the shattered optimism that existed in and around 1776. And we begin to get a sense of a part of the story behind the origins of the Constitution of the United States that's rarely told: the issue of the social question. It's kind of sensitive. The issue of gated communities is sensitive because no way am I in a position to criticize people who live in them, nor criticize people who don't live in them. But I think the fact that they are here, the fact that they are so prevalent amongst us, is an indication to which the social question is still real. I think after we come back after our break, we'll see even more of this. We have reached the top of the hour. It's 2 p.m. in the East. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a 5-minute break, we'll be right back. I hope you'll stay with us. Please do. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome back to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. It is the first day of December. It is a pleasure. If you have been with us through our first hour, I thank you for staying with us. If you are just joining us, welcome. Welcome to the program. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number, area code 304-663-4676. That's area code 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to email me directly, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Our subject in today's program here at the Virtual Center is the topic of the so-called social question. It's an issue that a lot of people haven't really figured out how to deal with, and so they don't. It's a question that I think everybody can appreciate as making a lot of sense, but at the same time it's a difficult one to talk about for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. By definition, it sometimes becomes personal. I think in the process of talking about a subject like this, we oftentimes reveal things about ourselves that we're not necessarily that comfortable with other people knowing. So, you know, at the risk of all of these things, I really believe, especially when you have a historian with the credentials of Gordon Wood, talk about the importance of the social question. He makes the point, and I think it's a point well worth consideration, well worth thinking about, that while we spend so much of our time focusing on structure of institutions, the relationships, if you will, between the House and the Senate, between the legislature and the executive branch, between the executive branch and the judiciary, and on and on and on. And we look at Madison's system and look at the Federalist Papers in an effort to elaborate and elucidate the various aspects of the Constitution and the way the system is designed to work. Rarely do we think about the people who make up these institutions. Gordon Wood makes the point, which I believe is quite well taken, that while Madison put a lot of his attention on structure, the fact of the matter is it wasn't just structure that bothered him. It was the people who were able to take advantage of this structure and achieve positions of influence and power for which they were not qualified, for which they were not capable, for which they were not educated well enough to hold those particular positions. The fact of the matter is, we begin to see very early in the founding, very early in the 1780s, in the late 1770s, after the Declaration of Independence in 76, we begin to see evidences in a number of states of concerns that maybe our optimism was a little bit beyond what it should have been. Maybe we went too far. One of the programs that I would like to one of the issues that I would like to address in an upcoming program is the Pennsylvania State Constitution of 1776. It is considered to be by those who study the origins of state constitutions, it's very popularly accepted as the most radical, the most democratic constitution of all the 13 original states. All power was located in the legislature. It did not have a Senate. It had a one-house legislature. The legislature wielded all the relevant power. There was no governor. Consequently, there was no governor veto over legislation. The optimism and the idealism of 1776 is probably more reflected in the state constitution of Pennsylvania than anywhere else. If republicanism is intended to be government of the people, and if, as many people believed, that the voice of the people when spoken is the voice of God, then why not put power in that portion of government which is directly able to articulate the will of the people, i.e., the will of God? So consequently, of all the state constitutions, Pennsylvania's is the most democratic, it is the most visionary, it is the most radical, if you use that term. But very early on, there are moves in Pennsylvania to reform that constitution and to take back some of the power that was inadvertently directed and given to the legislature. And the state of Pennsylvania experiences constitutional reform early in the 1780s, which makes the state constitution a bit less extreme, a bit less democratic than the initial draft in 1776. We know, for example, it's generally talked about that the state constitution of Massachusetts, which is approved finally in 1780, is considered at the time to be the perfect constitution, the best constitution of all the states. It's modeled very, very directly on the British Constitution. And of course, one of the ironies of the American movement for independence is that while the colonies are fighting for their independence from the mother country, never do they turn on the British Constitution. They never blame the British Constitution for the problems of the colonies. They believe that the intent of the British Constitution has been jeopardized and damaged by Parliament, by the politicians, by the king. That in a sense, it's not the instrument of government that went awry, it was the people appointed to manage it. And so the American people continue to hold faith in the British Constitution as being the absolutely perfect constitution. The state of Massachusetts drafts its constitution in 1780, principally through the work of John Adams. And the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 is considered to be among the best. And part of the reason it is considered to be among the best is because it is modeled so closely on the British Constitution in many ways. Madison and Hamilton are aware of this. They know that those who drafted constitutions during the Revolution did some yeoman work. There's some good instruments out there. But as Gordon Wood points out, their concern is not with the structure. Their concern is with the people, the kind of people who are managing the structure. The thoughts, the intent of the revolution, the degree of change that occurred in America as a result of independence. When it gets into the area of what we call the social question, it results in the emergence of people into positions of influence and power that they're not qualified to have, not qualified to hold in the eyes of many people. In the late 19th and early 20th century in American history, there's a tremendous controversy that breaks out. It rears its head over and over again throughout history. And in America, it's a struggle between what is called old money and new money. And as a result of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th and early 20th century, you get the emergence of what many people refer to as the nouveau riche, new money, new wealth. People who overnight have become wealthy, multimillionaires. The Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies, who have used their positions in coal and steel and railroads to achieve incredible wealth and incredible power. And within many states, within much of the nation, there is a concern that while these people have wealth and power, they don't have the kind of upbringing that should be and must be associated with the exercise of power. They don't have the kind of education that goes with it. And the people who are most inclined to make this argument are those that we would associate with old money, the old established families that go all the way back into the colonial period and have been in this country for generations and have established positions of influence and power and prestige, not only in politics, not only in economics, but in the arts, in culture. These are the people who raise their children to assume power when they reach the necessary age. The stories during the early period of the founding of John Adams taking John Quincy with him on trips to England and from England over to Paris, and making sure that John Quincy experiences all the capitals of Europe. And he's sent at one point to St. Petersburg in Russia in order to rub shoulders, if you will, with the czars. And the assumption is that John Quincy was born and educated to be president. John and Abigail raised him for that reason. They educated him for that reason. And therefore his education, his Harvard education, was broad and deep. He was well-read. He was multilingual. He spoke and read a number of different languages. He was into the arts. He was into music. He was into dancing. He was into culture. In other words, when you talked about a position of influence and power, he fit there. But in the late 19th century, the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and these overnight millionaires who come from nowhere into positions of wealth and influence caused tremendous consternation among the established power structure in America. And you read a number of written pieces addressing the issues of culture and class and cosmopolitanism and people who are reared and educated to govern. We are experiencing a similar situation in America today as a result of the communications revolution, with the Googles and the Amazons. We are talking about huge corporations where people are becoming multi-billionaires. Bill Gates. People that, in Bill Gates' case, quit college. They're kind of learning on the job. And the concern is that the arts will suffer. Culture will suffer. Because these people don't have the, quote, brazen, unquote, to hold the kinds of positions that their wealth and influences entitles them to hold. And so we're seeing a lot of that same nouveau riche argument today. The irony is the people who represent old money today are the people that represented new money a century ago. I'm thinking specifically of the Kennedy family. And the patriarch of the family, Joseph Kennedy, who made a lot of his money in international commerce in Scotch whiskey, who became part of the nouveau riche at the turn of the 20th century, but now the Kennedys are considered old money. And people compare the class and the polish that these people exude as opposed to the raw power of money and influence. People that sign multi-year millionaire and multi-millionaire contracts in athletics, for example. These overnight multi-millionaires who played football while they were attending college and really didn't attend college and got none of the raising, none of the class, none of the accoutrements of the positions and the influence that they hold in society. Evidences of it. Think of the attitudes, the media's attitude towards, for example, Tom Brady, the quarterback of the New England Patriots. Why Tom Brady seems to be the perfect example of what we want in athletics. He's well read, he's polished, he's well educated, he's got, all of the things. He's well spoken. He lives a good, clean life. He's a father and a family man. He's married to a gorgeous woman. All the things that we look for in society as being measures of success, Tom Brady seems to fit them. But in the eyes of many people, a lot of them don't. I'm thinking specifically of Ray Rice, who comes from a culture which finds it acceptable to slug their wife. And how uncomfortable that makes people feel. And how people begin to make the distinction between these different types. It's real and it's there. And it's all around us. And it was all around the founders. The most difficult thing is talking about it. Because nobody wants to paint themselves as an elitist. But the fact of the matter is, in many, many ways, many of us are. And that's the issue that we're talking about. The extent to which the Constitution of the United States is, in fact, a document, a structure, designed primarily by elites for elites. There's quite a bit of evidence to support this kind of thinking. George Washington. We have probably had too good an opinion of human nature in forming our confederation, unquote. John Dickinson. The debate over the Confederation really amounts to a debate between the worthy against the licentious. The worthy against the licentious. And here's the Otis quote. Whenever the pot boils, the scum will rise. James Otis warned in 1776. In Baltimore, in the Maryland Gazette, one writer in 1777 talked about the degree to which Whiggism is run mad in America. When a man who is only fit to patch a shoe attempts to patch a state, he fancies himself to be a Solon or a Lycurgus. He cannot fail to meet with public contempt. When a man who is fit only to patch a shoe attempts to patch the state and fancies himself a Solon or a Lycurgus, he cannot fail to meet with public contempt. Unquote. Specious, interested, designing men, men respectable neither for their property, their virtue, nor their abilities, are taking the lead in public affairs as never before. Thousands of the most respectable people, quote, who obtained their possessions by the hard industry, continued sobriety, and economy of themselves or their virtuous ancestors, are now witnessing in all states over and over many men whose fathers they would have disdained to have sat with the dogs of their flocks, raised to immense wealth, or at least to carry the appearance of a haughty, supercilious, and luxurious spendthrift. Unquote. Thousands of people who obtained their possessions by hard industry, continued sobriety, and economy of themselves or their virtuous ancestors are now witnessing in all states over and over many men whose fathers they would have disdained to have sat with the dogs of their flocks, raised to immense wealth, or at least to carry the appearance of a haughty, supercilious, and luxurious spendthrift. Effrontery and arrogance, even in our virtuous and enlightened days, wrote John Jay, are giving rank and importance to men whom wisdom would have left in obscurity. What a powerful, powerful statement from John Jay. Effrontery and arrogance, even in our various and enlightened days, are giving rank and importance to men whom wisdom would have left in obscurity. Government seems to be falling into the hands of those whose ability or situation in life does not entitle them to it. Unquote. And there is just page after page after page of similar examples. Let me share this one from Gordon Wood. This is a little bit lengthy. This is a piece written by Hugh Henry Brackenridge. Hugh Henry Brackenridge lived in Western Pennsylvania. He was born a poor farmer, educated himself, went to the College of New Jersey, Princeton, and ended up serving in government. In 1792, this was after the Constitution, Breckinridge of Pennsylvania published a novel entitled Modern Chivalry. And I'm going to read what Gordon Wood talks about in relation to Brackenridge's book entitled Modern Chivalry. Liberty, he wrote in 1779, would call forth the powers of human genius, and an honest husbandman like me could rapidly improve in every kind of knowledge, thus to become capable of any office to which the gale of popularity amongst his countrymen may raise him. His concern, however, is that when he gets in the legislature of Pennsylvania, he's noticing that the people of Western Pennsylvania are not sending to the legislature the kind of representatives like him. He's specifically talking about one representative who becomes a leader of the radical element within the Pennsylvania legislature, William Findley from Western Pennsylvania. And this is what he says in his book, Modern Chivalry. To rise from the cellar to the Senate would be an unnatural hoist. To come from counting threads and adjusting them to the splits of a reed, to regulate the finances of a government, would be preposterous, there being no congruity in that case. It would be a reversion of the order of things. And then he goes on to address the hero of his Modern Chivalry, a servant named Tague O'Regan. Notice the Irish, O'Regan, who gains a position of dominance without going through the proper social ranks and acquiring the dignities of social leadership, and how incredibly embarrassing Tague O'Regan becomes to all those forced to serve with him. And that's Breckinridge's whole thesis, is how people are ending up in positions of influence for which they have absolutely none of the prerequisites. He says there's a certain pride in man which leads him to elevate the low and pull down the high. Elevation in office. This is William Packer, governor of Maryland. Elevation in office and wealth and titles and political rank and dignity have no influence at all in making men good or honest. In South Carolina, I'm trying to paraphrase here because I don't want to bore you with too much of this, but at the same time, I really want to make the point. In South Carolina, there's a story that emerges about a tavern keeper who finds himself in the South Carolina legislature named William Thompson. And he gets in trouble because he insults John Rutledge. We've seen the name John Rutledge before, a very prominent member of the South Carolina legislature. And in response, because Rutledge is so insulted, Thompson writes an address to the people in April of 1784, and this according to Wood, which turns out to be a classic expression of American resentment against social superiority. Thompson said, "It is a resentment voiced on behalf of the people, more especially who go at this day under the opprobrious appellation of the lower orders of men." And what Thompson is doing is writing in defense of those people who are being associated or stereotyped into what society refers to as the lower orders of men. Thompson says that he's not simply attacking a few aristocratic nabobs who had humiliated him in the South Carolina legislature. Rather, he is assaulting the entire conception of a social hierarchy ruled by an elite. Rather than preparing men for political leadership in a free government, said Thompson, signal opulence and influence, especially when united by intermarriage or otherwise, are really calculated to subvert republicanism. In other words, what Thompson is talking about is this elitism, this snobism from people who intermarry with other families of their anticipated class. The persons and conduct of South Carolina nabobs like John Rutledge, he says, in private life may be unexceptionable and even amiable, but their pride, influence, ambition, connections, wealth, and political principles ought in public life ever to exclude them from public confidence. These people are phonies. They are artificial snobs. They are a disgrace to the concept of republicanism, says William Thompson. And then Woods goes on, in sardonic tones, Thompson recounted how he, a tavern keeper, a wretch of no higher rank in the Commonwealth than that of common citizen, has been debased by those self-exalted characters who affect to compose the grand hierarchy of the state for having dared to dispute with a John Rutledge or any of the nabob tribe. This is the kind of attack that frightens the Madisons and the Hamiltons and all the rest of it. Basically, it speaks to an age in which the William Thompsons are reacting against the artificiality and the snobism that seems to be associated with power and position and influence in American society. These people are taking republicanism seriously. They really believe that republicanism involves changes which go way beyond government structure itself, that go right to the very heart and soul of society itself. If I may, and I mentioned at the beginning of today's program that every once in a while some of this stuff by definition becomes personal and you can't help it. Let me share with you, and a lot of you will probably understand more about me after I tell you this story, but I have two examples of this. The first one was when I went to graduate school, when I graduated from college. I went to a state teachers college in Boston. It is no longer in existence. Once the University of Massachusetts opened a branch in Boston, a branch of the university, the main campus is in Amherst, but once the University of Massachusetts opened its Boston campus, then the state college that was there closed. And the state college that was there was a commuter institution where I received my teaching degree. And I graduated. It was the name of it officially was Boston State College. And when I graduated, I had a license to teach history. But I think I've mentioned this before, I didn't really believe that I had a sufficient background in history. I had had a lot of education classes, a lot of how to teach, how to do lesson plans, how to manage a classroom, those kinds of things, how to put together a good test. But in terms of history, I felt woefully deficient. So I made the decision, after talking it over with folks at home, I made the decision that I would go somewhere and pursue a master's degree in history so that when I walked into the history classroom to teach, I would be comfortable that I had something to teach. So I went to the chairman of our history department at the time and told him of my concerns. And I said, I'd like your recommendation as to master's programs in American history that I might be able to attend. And without batting an eye, without turning around, he reached behind him, opened the cabinet door behind his desk, and pulled 3 college catalogs from the top of a pile that he had there. And he handed me 3 catalogs and said, here are 3 institutions. All of them are pretty good institutions. You do well in any one of these. The 3 institutions were Boston University, Harvard University, and the University of Wisconsin. And I went home with these 3 catalogs under my arm, and I went about the business of applying for graduate school. I had absolutely no idea on the face of this face of this earth what I was doing. But I went home and told my folks that the chairman of the history department had recommended these 3 institutions. And of course, my dad's first comment was, well, Boston University and Harvard. And as he said, I don't know who would want to go to the University of Wisconsin. It's in the middle of nowhere. Because my dad figured anything west of the Boston suburbs was nowhere. So anyway, I applied to all 3 graduate schools. And I'm glad to say, I'm proud to say, I guess, that I was admitted to all 3. But the issue became money. Boston University, I received no scholarship support at all. At Harvard, I received a tuition scholarship. But my concern about Harvard was that it was the School of Education. The degree that I applied for was a master, what they called an MAT, a Master of Arts in Teaching. It was more education classes along with the history classes. I felt like I had an awful lot of education classes already, so that one, even though it was Harvard, it caused me to pause. The University of Wisconsin, however, seemed perfect. It was admission to a program based in American history with an emphasis on the American Revolution and Constitution, and an opportunity to study under the tutelage of Merrill Jensen, who was one of the most noted Revolution Confederation historians of the time. Not only that, but the University of Wisconsin was willing, in order to enable me to go there, was willing to grant me an out-of-state scholarship, which meant that I would pay the same rates as a resident of the state of Wisconsin. I would not have to pay out-of-state rates. What that meant was, at that time, this was in the mid-60s, tuition for a Wisconsin resident at the University of Wisconsin was $300 or $400. It was almost nothing. So therefore, I had the opportunity with federal money, by borrowing money, I had the opportunity to go to one of the best institutions in American history in the country and study under one of the most noted scholars in the country, get my master's degree for very little expense, relatively speaking. I was able to borrow the money that it would cost me to live in the dormitories, and of course I didn't spend much, so consequently it was the deal, and I ended up accepting the University of Wisconsin. The first day that I showed up in Madison on campus, there was a sign on the history department door telling us to go, telling new graduate students to go immediately to their faculty advisor, their major professor. In my case, it was Merrill Jensen, and they had a list of all the office numbers there. So I went down and knocked on the door and heard her come in, and there sitting behind the desk was Merrill Jensen. And I introduced myself. My name's Bill O'Brien. And Mr. Jensen invited me to come in and sit down. And I did. And he said, Bill, I am so excited to have you in seminar. It has been years since we've had a student from Boston College here at the university. And I looked at him kind of strange and said, Professor Jensen, you made a mistake. I didn't graduate from Boston College. I graduated from Boston State Teachers College. And he looked at me and said, what the hell is that? And right there, I knew that my scholarship, my invitation, and then my admission into the history department at the University of Wisconsin was a mistake. I got on the phone that night. I called my dad, and I said, I think you may have been right, Dad. I think this is not going to last too long. I'll be home pretty quick. The first meeting of the seminar, of Mr. Jensen's seminar, was on a Monday afternoon. And I went to the meeting, and it was this huge table with about 20 people sitting around it. And these were Professor Jensen's graduate students. And there were 9 of us that were new first-year graduate students in his seminar. There were about 12 of his advanced students, the students that he'd already had there for a year or two. So we all sat around, and Professor Jensen asked all 9 of us, the new graduate students, to introduce themselves. And all my colleagues, beginning graduate students, many of them who became very good friends of mine over the years, introduced themselves. One I remember specifically was had graduated from Swarthmore. Another, who became one of my closest friends, Bob Becker, graduated from St. Lawrence University up in New York State. Another one graduated from Claremont College in California. Another graduated from Texas Tech. And on and on and on, as I was absolutely stunned by the institutions that these people graduated from. And then it came around to me. And just as I started to introduce myself, Professor Jensen took the floor and said, Bill, if I may. And he said, gentlemen, 'cause it was all men. Professor Jensen did not accept women into his graduate programs. It was all men. Professor Jensen said, gentlemen, I want you to meet Bill O'Brien. Bill graduated from a teacher's college in downtown Boston. He comes from a working class family, and this is a quote that I will never forget my entire life. And he's here to see how the other half lives. And right then, I knew that I was behind the 8 ball. I had a weaker undergraduate education than anybody else because I was not. I went to a teacher's college. I did not have the scholarly background. I was not as well read in the field, and yet I was expected to launch right into a research project in order to do a master's degree, in order to get my master's degree from the University of Wisconsin. I also informed Professor Jensen that I only wanted the master's degree because I wanted to teach. I wanted some history background so I could teach history in high school. And he said, nobody comes here for a master's degree. The only ones who get master's degree are the graduate students that we dismiss because they are not qualified to go on for the doctorate. When we send you on your way, we'll give you a master's degree to leave with, is what he basically said. In other words, we do not consider the master's degree worth anything. So that was my education, and that was my introduction to graduate school. How does this relate to the subject we're doing today? Have you ever been in a situation in which you knew you were totally out of place, that you didn't belong there? Have you ever been invited to dinner and went to sit down at a table and suddenly realized that there was more knives and forks and spoons at where you were sitting than you had ever seen in your life? Or there were three glasses, three different kinds and different shaped glasses, and you didn't know which one was what. Have you ever been out of pocket and felt it? Felt like you were out of your element? I did. Let me share with you my second story. After teaching in Richmond, Virginia, in community college for a number of years, I was caught in a reduction in enrollment, which meant that the institution eliminated 37 teaching positions in one whack, in 1 year, one Thanksgiving, mid-semester, mid-year, the end of the first semester. 37 faculty members were terminated because of a drastic reduction in enrollment. I was one of those. So in the mid-'80s, there I was with a PhD in history and no job. And then I began to look, and I began to look around and began to look for other jobs. One of the positions I applied for, I received a word from a friend about this position, was the executive director of a graduate center in Virginia, the state of Virginia. It housed 3 different public universities in the state of Virginia. Virginia Tech, Old Dominion, and I'm trying to remember, I can't remember the third one. Could be the University of Virginia. But anyway, it was a graduate center that they were opening in Virginia Beach. And I was invited to interview for the directorship of that institution, of that graduate center. I wanted it so bad I could taste it. For one thing, I love Virginia Beach. And I love the idea of a graduate center with all of these different institutions represented there. In other words, as you recruited graduate students, they could go to their strength because each institution was different. Anyway, I was interviewed along with a number of others. I don't know how many, 3 or 4. And I spent all day. I was invited to Virginia Beach, put up at a hotel. The next morning, I was invited to meet with the president of one of the 3 universities. And then I was shuttled from one office to the other as I interviewed throughout the day, over lunch and everything else. And I had been told that the day would end with dinner. I would have an opportunity to share dinner with a number of the people that I would be working with, deans, department chairs, etc. We went to this absolutely fabulous restaurant in Virginia Beach. Obviously very expensive. And I was sitting at a table with about 12 people, deans, directors, guidance counselors, etc. And the first thing that I was made aware of at the end of this long day of interviews was that one of the requirements of getting this position was that I was responsible for ordering the wine for dinner. My working class background growing up in Boston obviously came out, because I realized that I had no more idea what wine to order than the man in the moon. And I became quite angry. And I tried desperately to contain myself. But finally I said, I read the job description for this position pretty carefully, and I can't remember being required to select wine as being part of the job description. At the same time, when I said that, I knew that not being able to select the wine was going to be the key to me not getting that position. I didn't get it. But I began to realize that as the years go by and as circumstances change, in many ways, we don't change. In many ways, we can't change. And in many ways, the us that is really us shows itself and comes through. Whether it's being unable, not having the background to be able to pick a good wine, or whether it's going to an institution, not having the kind of background that allows you to get into a prestigious graduate program. But I had experience in those two situations, two examples of being out of place. I knew what it felt like to not know which knife or which fork to use with which course in a multi-course dinner. And I also knew that the people responsible for hiring an executive director at this graduate center wanted a particular type of person, a person who was raised choosing wine. And consequently, they didn't want me. This is real. The world is real. And the people who are expressing themselves in these quotations are real people. And they are expressing their frustrations, either because they're being debased and insulted and they don't feel like they're being accepted because they are considered to be second-class citizens, or the other side of the coin, people who believe that they ought to be living in gated communities and suddenly found out that somehow I got through. But the fact of the matter is it existed in colonial America. It existed at the time of the founding. It clearly played a significant role in the structure and design of the Constitution of the United States. It continues to drive the economy today. It continues to drive the expansion and growth of gated communities in America. It continues to cause people to live on credit cards way beyond what they can afford in order to create the illusion and the appearance of being different people than they really are, by driving cars they can't afford, wearing clothes they can't afford, reading books they never read, listening to music they don't understand. And in many ways, many of us are thrust into the positions of living sham lives. To believe that this was not a factor in the 1780s at the time of the founding is naive. To measure exactly how important a factor it was is difficult. I'd like to pick up with this theme again tomorrow and maybe do a little bit more with it. but right now we do have to sign off. It's close to the top of the hour. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you'll be able to tune in tomorrow. Thank you.